I'm sorry. Celibacy puts you in an automatic pedestal that somehow you are more holy just because you are doing great in restraining your sex appeal, even though that it might be overflowing anyway. Within it, the concept of celibacy in itself is an outdated concept that no longer Pope should embrace at the end, because firstly, it pollutes what a clergy should be, and secondly, it created disattachment between the clergy and also the constituency it has inside of the status quo. So as the Pope, I will come and say that you are now going to be allowed to marry and you can date someone. However, unfortunately, you still have to do it in accordance to the law. So if the law say that you cannot polygamy, guys, there is enough to enough. You cannot have multiple wives. And note that there will still be imams and there will still be none under our world that will still want to do celibacy. We are fine with that, and we think that will create even a greater amount of appreciation towards this individual. But moreover, it is more important for us to understand that this shouldn't be a requirement of you going inside of the clergy in itself. So what are the holiness under our world? We think we're going to redefine the holiness not to the amount of restraint that you have in your sex, but also how you are able to have your religious knowledge, how also you're able to engage with your constituency and other things. We think this parameter of holiness is going to create more coherence inside of the Catholic Church in itself, and it's going to be more better in how you create holiness to begin with. Two contributions that I'm going to bring in this debate. Firstly, how do clergy needs to be a bridge between the Pope and to the people. We think the essence of what a clergy is not only about how they need to understand the afterworld or how they need to understand the heaven or hell or how they're simply a holy person. We think essentially clergy is an extension of what Pope is in order for you to connect the Pope and the people. I'm going to tell you why do I think that all the clergy and the holiness of celibacy is creating disattachment and creating a taking for granted a feeling towards these clergy at the end, and therefore we need to change that. When you become a clergy and become inside of the clergy and become holy, we think that requirement in itself makes a pedestal of you. So in the worst case scenario, we think it is possible that you as a clergy will take things for granted, because that means that you are simply more holier now, and therefore we think that you are less likely to be able to engage to your constituency, because you think that the afterworld is the utmost important. Before that, sure.
Is the Pope still going to have some sort of a stance on sexual relations, say pornography, masturbation, the hookup culture, or normal?
We think hookup culture and other things could be debated later, but we think more importantly, this should be the first step inside of the Pope mind, so that you can have that ongoing discussion whether or not hookup culture could be right in the Catholicism, on whether or not you need to have multiple wives. I don't know, right? But then, what do we tell you on this? We think when you have all this requirement that is already existing under their world, which is all this holiness, we think you are less likely to engage to your constituency. Why does this happen? Because when you as a nun, for example, comes up out there and you have all this halo being very holy and whatnot, your constituency in essence will think that, okay, so the amount of holiness that I need to do is very, very unexceptionally high. We think it is more likely for me as an individual who has all this sexual urge and whatnot to think that I'm very disattached to my nuns, because my nuns most likely will not listen to my sex dilemma and whatnot, right? We think this kind of disattachment between the clergy and the constituency is what makes church even less relevant right now. If you compare it to Christian church, in which their imams, for example, I don't know what's the name, the person, for example, be able to marry, at the very least you'll be able to have discussion on how you conduct a correct marriage, which is very resonating to your plight as an individual. We think if you talk about other plight, you need to go to heaven and you need to go to hell, but what do I think about what do I do with my current sexual urge, right? We think all these things needs to be considered in the place of the clergy in itself, so they will also be able to conduct a better engagement towards their constituency at the end. Therefore, within the concept of clergy should not be only about your relationship with your God, but also should be a relationship between you and your constituency. And we think that attachment can only happen if you do not put them in a pedestal called celibacy. Secondly, what is the problem of celibacy and why do we think it is very important for you to have the relevancy of the church? Before that,
would you also require clergies to memorize things like Bibles and know what a God is and all the history of religion?
I don't know why you're asking that, but obviously yes, because you're going to be a clergy anyway, right? The question would be on whether or not you should impose this thing that calls like the amazing sex to be able to like be given up. We don't think that's a good thing. My second contribution, what do I talk to you about in regards of relevancy of the ongoing discussion inside of the church in itself? CO tells you that you know what that exactly okay. I understand that CO will tell you about what hookup culture and other things. We think this is exactly the momentum that Pope has inside of the status quo to start all this discussion that could be necessary to their side. Note that, Mr. Madam Chair, because of the absence of all this discussion, horrible things happen under their world. I'm talking about sexual harassment inside of the Catholic Church, for example, which probably I would argue that happens because you restrain so much, by the way, but most of the time that is because you do not have any kind of discussion in regards of sex and in regards of even like sexual education and how you shouldn't be a pedophile. We think that discussion can only happen if you start to humanize clergy at the end, because that is the only way for you to be able to have a localized discussion as compared to seeing all this stuff as taboo. Mr. Madam Chair, we think it is important for you to recognize that human beings are always going to be attached to their natural instinct. We think it is the very momentum for Pope to recognize this and be able to firstly connect the clergy and the constituency, and secondly to spark the discussion that could be necessary for the future of the church so that they become even more relevant in the status quo. Very proud to propose.
Right. We from opening opposition are going to nuance the debate. We think that the debate happens from the perspective of the Pope and specifically Pope Francis. Considering that you're a progressive ally to all Catholics around the world, we think that there are fights that you can engage in and there are fights that you simply don't need to. We think that out there, when there are things that are pertaining more to majority of the Catholics in the world and things that are more relatable, for example, like your stance on homosexuality, your stance on abortion, your stance on contraception, we think that in order for us to have a conversation around those things, we don't think it's in the position of Pope Francis to strategically distance himself from the majority of Catholics out there. To that extent, I'll ask three questions in my speech. Firstly, what's the rationale behind clerical celibacy and why are we okay with that? Secondly, what are the strategic calculated risks of a pope that you must make in this 21st century context? And thirdly, what is the structure of the Holy See? And we don't think the debate is merely about the pros and cons of clerical celibacy. We think we have to take into account the organized structure of the Catholicism and discuss what will potentially happen as a form of backlash when it comes to us allowing this. But before that, let's just tackle OG in a few straight rebuttals that don't fit into my questions. Firstly, they say that now your priests and your, for example, cardinals and your bishops are seen as more holy. We think that is due because Catholicism is a value system anyway. So, like to a certain extent, obviously everything you do, there'll be a differentiation of to what extent you are a Catholic. But we think that a lot of times there are things that in the Bible that already you must feel in order for you to qualify as a cardinal or as a priest. To the extent the POI coming from opening opposition has a point. To the extent that we say that you still need to, for example, memorize a lot of things that are archived, memorize a lot of things that are in the Bible. To the extent we say that will also affect your ability to then, for example, converse with the modern world. But to the extent that they are required to do this and are still able to do it in status quo means that there is no such isolation that you want. But if you listen closely to them, they say that you're less likely to engage with your constituency as if this is about politicians, right? We think that that problem is not mutually exclusive to this debate. That problem is a problem with hierarchy and organized religion, which will still exist under their side. To the extent that you still say that there are certain persons that are deemed of being able to for example, absolve you of your sins, to be able to grant you forgiveness, all those things will still exist on their side. But also they say, this bizarre idea that now priests will take things for granted. Obviously this needs a clarification on how necessarily you're promoted through the ranks. We think that everyone starts from deacon, and after that, if you do things well and people trust you more, you become bishops, then archbishops, and then after that, you get promoted to like the Council of the Holy See in Vatican City. To that extent, we say if there is a problem that you're unlikely to engage and you're an asshole, then we say you won't be promoted and you won't be in a position for you to have that much power and that much ability to abuse the power anyways. So we think the ability or the problems that opening government had has already been minimized. Let's move into the idea then, my positive material. What's the rationale behind clerical celibacy? We think that agreeing with what opening government say, priests are an extension of the Pope, which is then directly an extension of God.
Yes.
We think to that extent, you need to be in the position of power for you to be able to grant certain powers that God bestowed upon you to people. What do I mean by this? Meaning to say that since the inception of Catholicism, the ability for you to absolve people of their sins, the ability for you to say, it's alright if you're homosexuals because ultimately God created us equal and we are all human, must come from a place that you're in the position to do so. To the extent we say there needs to be a certain requirement that means to say that you need to be closer, for example, to the Pope and closer to God to that. To that extent, we say the entire Bible is a value system. But to the extent that we say we have value systems which are less harmful and less pernicious to the extent of clerical celibacy because there's still a rationale behind that, is a way for us to actually make sure that we grant some form of legitimacy to the priesthood, clerical organization and still allow them to do that. On your side as well, you need to recognize that not every individual and not every Catholics are expected to be priests. To that extent, we say if, for example, you still want to help out your religion but don't want to take clerical celibacy, you can be a person who helps out in the church, you can be a person, for example, like a deacon who can still get married. To that extent, we say when we put you in a position for you to be able to grant a lot of the power of Catholicism onto individuals, we think that then you need to be differentiated from them. To the extent where we say there is an explicit verse in Corinthians something that says that you cannot do this, then we think you cannot explicitly sin because then you loses any ability for you to carry out your power that's been granted to you by God. The conclusion is we think it's rational because you need to be able to sin as a person who's able to help out fellow Catholics out there when you think it's okay for you to be different in the long run. I'll take you in a while. Sit down, please, Eric. Second idea, strategic calculated risk of a pope. One thing that opening government conveniently missed out is that we have other fights out there that are not only about clerical celibacy. What am I talking about? Fourfold. Number one, the idea of abortion. Number two, the idea of contraception. Number three, stance on homosexuality. And number four, the idea of divorce. We think that in all those ideas, the utility of you being able to take a positive stance in that means that you can help out exponentially more people. Why do I mean by this? In places, for example, like Philippines, where you're unable to legally get divorced and you can only be annulled, we think that the Pope, in a way, implicitly saying that it's okay for you to annul once, for example, if your marriage is not consummated or it's not sacrament, means that that ability for you must still be there. Meaning to say that there are two utilities behind being a pope. Number one, to unite Catholics out there to be able to say and not give leeway, for example, to extremely conservative Catholics to say that you're deviant from the teachings of the Bible, meaning to say you need to be able to preserve Catholicism as a religion. But secondly, as Pope Francis itself, we think there's a scale and there's an urgency to every step that you do. Meaning to say that you need to be able to remain relevant in the eyes of Catholics in order to make sure that you can have a say on things. We think that we are already taking a step towards the better. We think when it comes to the idea of a very dogmatized religion, we need to take stepwise approach in order to make sure that we solve out problems one by one. To the extent that we think Pope Francis is capable of saying that contraception is okay in times of Zika and that homosexuality are things that you can forgive, we think that that is a better fight. Go.
Do you think sexual desires go away? If not, why isn't this an unrealistic expectation?
Okay, we think sexual desires are something that you cannot impose on every single individual. We concede, yes, there might be some individuals, but we think that ability, for example, for you to be able to enter the priesthood is something that a conscious individual make. Meaning to say that if the individual can make a value judgment that he or she can, for example, put the sexual desire as a secondary pedestal to the ability to serve as a servant of God, then we think it's fine that we already tell them before and have a very clear stance on it. Thirdly, on the structure of a Holy See, we think that the idea is that we agree that papal conclave happens, you are elected through, for example, them releasing white smoke instead of black smoke. But the fact that they voted you in means that they can also vote you out. What are the three ways that a pope is absolved of his duty? Number one, when the pope dies in service. Number two, through voluntary retirement, for example, like Pope Benedict. And thirdly, when the council, for example, deems that you're no longer a person that is deemed to represent the interests of Catholics, they can throw you out. To the extent we say, it's a value judgment. We think that as Pope Francis, when you have so much fight out there to be able to say and shed the light, for example, of Catholicism, for you to be able to make life for progressive Catholics much better across out there, we think that we must choose our fight. Ultimately, we think that in the long run, we might want this to happen. But in the short run, we say that we cannot afford to be able to isolate Catholics and cannot be affording to give them political ammo to deem us as illegitimate. Extremely proud to oppose. Notice that their main benefit is discussion towards other issues like abortion and homosexuality. While I'm going to elaborate this further in my speech, what I'm going to tell you further for this instance is that abortion and homosexuality is pretty much a worldly concern, which means that under their side of the house, you can separate spirituality and this discussion because a priest and whole clergyman doesn't experience that, ladies and gentlemen. That's why you cannot have a spiritual discussion on what homosexuality means towards the Catholic Church, simply because all of the Catholic Church has already demonized that as being unholy to begin with. Catholic Church and the whole priest never experienced divorce, and that's how you don't create any sort of like spiritual discussion under their side of the house as well. Only our side of the house, which addresses spiritual concerns and also worldly concerns, because we bridge them towards clergymen that are exclusive towards our proposal. We think that it's high time for the Catholic Church and especially the Pope, which are progressive, we concede, to acknowledge that these clergymen also have sexual needs, and these sexual needs also transcend towards real life and towards real life problems. So again, what I'm going to talk to you is two things. First of all, how do we best fulfill the role of clergy in society? But secondly, how this solves the current problems within the Catholic Church. So firstly, how do we best fulfill the role of clergy? They say that, these people have already made that consent. Okay, people made this value judgment of becoming a priest before the celibacy kills them, ladies and gentlemen. But because notice that every human being has their own inherent sexual need, and if you restrain them for so long, some human being just cannot cope up with it, ladies and gentlemen. That is just biology. But what we tell you further is that this has already created problems inside of the status quo, where people made this value judgment beforehand, and they don't like what celibacy does to them. That's why they created all these underground sex scandals that's happening in the Catholic Church to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. They cannot just simply say that people make this value judgment, because in the status quo right now, this value judgment has already been proven to be false. But what we tell you exclusively from Stella to begin with is that we already acknowledge what is a clergyman. A clergyman is an extension from God and the Pope towards the whole world. This also to say that the clergy means that an individual can have a certain religious salvation and spiritual holiness while maintaining their individuality as a human being. The problem with this is that under their side, the standard of how an individual can achieve holiness will be heightened. That is to say that under their side of the house, the narrative is that you can actually do celibacy and become a human being. This means that all of the things that is outside the celibacy is already being considered unholy to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. Which means that under our side of the house, you get several things. Firstly, we say that under our side, we get the Catholic Church to recognize that the clergyman is also a human being. This means to say that every other human being in this world and every other the member of congregations within the Catholic Church also have the same need as this clergyman. And ergo, if this clergyman can do both of these stuffs at the same time, that means that an individual can also have a spiritual salvation and their own version of what it means to have a healthy marriage life at the same time. You can only bridge that if you can show to the whole world that the clergyman can already do that. That is how you get an extension from the Pope and from the God, because notice that these individuals are not God, right? These individuals are still human beings, and we respect that individuality under our side of the house. They say then that you have power by God, therefore you shouldn't fuck it up, right? But the power of the clergyman, we already contended, shouldn't become granted to you to begin with. You shouldn't say that just because I restrain from masturbation for several weeks, that means that I have power and I'm more holy than the rest of society and the rest of the congregation. We don't like those kinds of imposition of power, because under our side of the house, what we say towards this clergyman is that, okay, you can do these several things, but then you also need to have a spiritual understanding under our side of the house, because that is the only way you can spread towards the society that you can bridge those values and you can bridge those necessities at the same time. You don't have that under the side of the house. We say that the imposition of power that is hierarchical towards this religious community and towards the whole congregation is precisely what makes a clergy becomes less relevant inside of society. Because what we contend at the end of the day is that the clergy should become a bridge between the society and the God and spiritual values. And the only way for them to have that bridge and to become that bridge is for them to understand both lives at the same time. We know it seems pretty hard, but what these clergy have signed up to do is for them to become an avenue for the society to speak up their concerns in order to achieve the spiritual salvation. You don't get that under your side if these worldly values of these individuals are not being transcended towards these priests. Before I move on closing.
I'll just explain to you that it's more likely that they lose the authority they need to guide people in the first place. Can you give some substantive reasons on why your scenario is more likely?
Okay, if the Pope already says that, you know what, like all clergies can do this and all clergies can do these sorts of things, most likely that all people will also try to listen to the Pope at the very least. That's what happens with homosexuality. Once the Pope say that homosexuality shouldn't be judged by everyone, that message transcended and being incepted towards the whole Catholic people. We say that this transformation also, obviously doesn't happen at only one day, because those values under their side has already been incepted in a long time. But under our side, if you do this right now, you can get this discussion of abortion and homosexuality even further and even better, ladies and gentlemen, which leads me to my second issue, how to solve the current problem within the Catholic Church. Firstly, let's talk about relevance. We say that the reason why Catholic Church is declining in the status quo is because of the lack of relevance towards the human lives compared to, for example, Christianity, where their pastors, for example, can get married and can instep all those values of Christianity towards this congregation as well. This is because the discussion about the inherent human need is being demonized the same way that you impose people not to steal, by the way, because stealing is strong. We know that stealing is strong, but if you put it in the same way that having sex is strong, we say that the demonization of this certain value will be incepted. And if people don't see that this inherent sexual need is actually demonized, ladies and gentlemen, these people are less likely to engage with the Catholic Church as a whole, ladies and gentlemen. We say that the Catholicism value, therefore, will become less relevant under their side of the house. But lastly, let's talk about other issues. In my introduction, I already told you how abortion and homosexuality is pretty much a worldly concern. Once you try to engage towards this first step, as I already told you, this is the only way you can try to also open up, for example, the gay network in Vatican, for example, on how these people also have their own sexual needs. But all of those worldly desires can only happen if you open this step towards non-celibacy. But lastly, we say is that people are already reluctant to become priests in the status quo precisely because of these measures. We as the Pope and we as the Catholic Church would not like for the Catholic Church's relevancy to become lesser and lesser because of the lack of priests inside of the status quo. That exclusively happens under their side of the house because people just believe that other religion can fulfill their need and their spiritual salvation. We need for the Catholic Church, and as the Pope, we need to gain that relevance back, and that only can happen under opening governments. We've never been prouder to propose.
So on the first day of debates, MDG gave a speech talking about what's the difference between this house produces the X should and this house X as X would. So which is why I think in this debate, it's not about what we think the Pope should do because, everyone is progressive now and it's very strategic for him to do so. But it's as the Pope Francis, what should you do? Which is why I think the argumentation that was brought about by the leader of opposition, i.e. Patrick, was one that was very important because it was talked about in the perspective of Pope Francis himself, the man of this debate, not just the state talking about it, but Pope Francis himself. Which is why, when the Deputy Prime Minister chose not to engage with these extensions, I think it is one that's problematic and will probably lead to their demise. Not literally, hopefully. In my speech, I'll talk about two things. First, this requirement per se and its justification for it. And secondly, how would the reaction of people be? I would extend on this further, not just talking about Pope Francis, not just Pope Francis, but also the Catholics as a whole. So first, requirements and justifications. Note that in every religious body, there are many requirements for many things in life. So for instance, in Buddhism, for you to be a priest, you have to be someone that has to shave your head. You have to wear someone who has to wear an orange robe per se. In Hinduism, for you to be a priest, you have to be someone who's vegetarian. You have to be someone who's from the Brahmin caste, for instance, and you memorize all these verses, etc. But why do we why do we go by this requirement? It's not because we like seeing a Buddhist monk in an orange robe and bald and we laugh at him all the time. No, it's because these are requirements of the religion per se. But having said that, there are merits to it. Why is it that we do this? We want these individuals to be the purest form of living beings on planet Earth. Why? Because they are extension of God and we have to have some form of relatability to them. Which is why as a Hindu priest, you do not eat meat because, well, God doesn't eat meat and that is something that is bad. The ideas like you giving into sexual temptations and etc., well, for you to be a priest is also a difficult life. But why is it that we celebrate this life? Because it's one that talks about you not giving into temptation. You persevering to whatever temptation you may or may not have, because that is the way that the religion goes by. That's the way how a priest should go by. Please sit down. And then closings at POI. Or do you think the sexual desire will still exist or go away? Of course, I suppose it would still exist. But if sexual desires are something you can control, it's not like you are so sexually active, you wank every 10 minutes because I can't control my sexual desire. That's bullshit, right? But also, even if it takes a lot for you to control, we think that is good. Because you are a man who's standing by and going by, this is my religion, this is what the requirements of my religion is. Yeah. And as a priest, which is forwarding what it is to persevere for it, what is it to not give into temptation, is a good example to tell people that this is life can still go on and it's a good sacrifice for you to make as a priest. Please sit down. But let's deal with sexual desire, because I think this is what closing we talked about, opening also talked about it. Number one, you can definitely control it, right? Second, they said, OG, that you will resort to raping kids because it's bottled up inside you, eventually burst. That is predicated on one, that all these years since Catholicism has been established, every priest has touched kids and molested kids because he couldn't bottle it in, and I don't think that is one that they can definitely prove. But second, sit down, if you by logic tell me that priests go around touching children, meaning more often than not they are pedophiles, under your side, in the Prime Minister's speech, she caveated saying that obviously what you're going to do must go by the law, meaning you can't have many wives, that's against polygamy. So, under your side, if you recognize that these adult priests are touching children, probably they're pedophiles, they still can't touch children legally under your side, even if you pass by celibacy, because they're probably going to be pedophiles as... Yeah, right? So I think the comparative is that you do not really solve this problem, and I think you're just homogenizing any and every problem these individuals in the priests have and saying that you can solve it. I don't think you'll be able to solve it. But their best case, let's say it is true that you really cannot control your urge for you to act upon sexual desire. What do you then do? Quit, for God's sake. It's not like it's not like a conscription method that you take in priests and you force them to become priests per se. We think quitting is a legitimate thing for you to do. Everything is fine. We'll defend it. Please sit down. Also note that the benefit OG wanted as a whole is relatability. That you want to see your priest as your bro from another mother, your Jenny from a blog, because you want to relate to this person. But also note, when I POI'd and asked, would you also force your priest to go by all the Bible verses and everything else is in the Bible except for wanting to live with another person? He said, yeah. That means an average Catholic who does not go by everything in the Bible, doesn't read the Bible per se, still cannot relate to this one priest. Why? Because you still make it exclusive to begin with. The bridge you talk about doesn't exist. There's no bridge under your side as well. And then we think that this is also one that's harmful. But second, why are we okay with defending that this person sticks by the Bible by hook or crook? Is because of the position of a priest. It's not by every lay person that we think every Catholics, people who follow by Catholicism, shouldn't get married. No, we're talking about a subgroup of people that because of the virtue of their position, how holy we look at them, we have to look at them as holy as possible, and we think we're okay with defending that, right? Before I go on to my second extension, opening.
Purity of leader in our world is contingent on how much you understand your religion. Why do you think purity in your abstinence of sex is a better purity at the end?
Because you abstaining from sex is you controlling your temptations. Sandy already explained. And we think that is also a way of you holding by religion. But also, if you want to go, as I already mentioned the thing earlier, that you don't bridge any gap because you still want these people to be as religious as possible, just that you can get married. I don't see how that works. Second, reactions of people. Note that as Pope Francis, you also have to take into account your biggest people who are not your biggest fan. So yes, maybe the liberal Catholics will cheer for this and the thing is happy, but how the conservative Catholics deal with this? That's the largest group of people in this debate. We tell you, number one, even if you don't make it as inclusive as possible, you shouldn't antagonize them. Some of the cornerstones of Catholics as being like things like abortion, contraception. Why? Because you think every life is a life and you shouldn't kill it. But why was it okay for Pope Francis to defend things like contraception? It was because of the outbreak of Zika virus, where it was a good thing for you to tell people, perhaps you use contraception because things have changed now. If you don't use it, it not only affect you, it affects your child as well. These things are more palatable for individuals who are conservative to see it because they can see the immediate effect of Zika virus. Their proposal, nobody can see the impact of why is it that this clergy suddenly want to get married. I don't see what's wrong with them. Like, you don't see that relatability. People can't relate to it. What they do then see is that the Pope overstepping his boundaries, which is why the impact Patrick talked about, of the impact of Pope Francis, of one is important. This Pope cannot simply say, let's just change what Catholicism is about and just go by it, right? You can't simply divorce some doctrines or the Bible verse, especially when there's no right justification from it, and you can't just say because we're progressive now. This is bad for the Pope, for Pope Francis as a whole, because it just further divides the types of people that exist within Catholicism, and we think this is one that's harmful. At the end of this debate panel, we think for you to fight the good fight, you don't fight all the fight. You choose what's the right fight, and yeah, thank you.
I never ever thought that my strong background within religion would ever help me in a debate. So there's a distinction in the Bible between what's a command and what's an advice. This is something you learn, right? Things such as go into the world and make disciples, i.e. go and preach to people, that's a command. Things such as I would rather you not get married, that's an advice. 1 Corinthians was written to fellow Christians, not to church leaders. That says something. There's a reason why we all don't stay celibate, right? Because it's not just church leaders that have to stay celibate, right? I'll explain to you, because literally all their case was to say that this is something that is essential, and so essential that the Pope can't do anything about it. But before that, a few responses. Firstly, they said clergy can decide. I think two responses to this. Firstly, this misses the fact that people always want to be clergy. People always want to be these things, right? You miss the fact that this is how they were brought up. And when you consider OG's argument about how they are looked on as on a pedestal, this is the reason why many people want to be clergies and many people will still go into this, right? But secondly, many people don't know what they are going up to, right? The optimism bias that tells you that I will never need to have sex, I would be okay being celibate, is something that makes people who aren't prepared still go in. That was a flippant response that was simply not sufficient. Secondly, cardinals won't be okay. I think firstly, I'm going to explain why this is not a core. And secondly, I think this is in the best interest of the Catholic Church, and I would analyze that argument from the point of view of the Catholic Church. Two arguments I'm going to bring within my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how this harms the Catholic Church and the clergy. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why removing celibacy is crucial in the current Catholic Church trajectory. First argument, why this harms the Catholic Church and the clergy. It's important to note that pedophilia is a real thing within the Catholic Church. You just had a recent scandal that happened, right? That literally led to the Pope resigning, right? This is something that is crucial within the Catholic Church. It's not just the case that you tell me that, not every priest touches children, right? It happens, and it's something that is extremely important. Two things on how it harms the Catholic Church. Firstly, it builds expectations within these clergy people. Why is this bad? Because it tells you that you are always a sinner. You always tell yourself that you are a sinner, that you've done something bad, and that constant feeling is something that we think is remarkably harmful and also gets in your way of carrying out your duties as a clergy person. They might say, you just go and repent, right? Firstly, it's hard for many of these people to summon the courage to go out and repent. That's why we never knew of how large pedophilia was within the Catholic Catholic Church. But secondly, even if you actually summon that courage and you go and repent, the fact that you constantly do it makes you feel constantly unclean, right? So you might be okay with saying that you just repented once, but at the point in which you feel, oh, I've been doing this way too much, I don't think this forgiveness is something that is still going to carry on, right? That's the constant feeling that people have. But secondly, how this creates a pedestal. It's not just harmful because of relatability, right? There are three reasons why it's extremely harmful. Firstly, it's harmful to the clergymen at the point in which they feel like they always constantly need to be on a pedestal, on a pedestal, right? That you all constantly have to act holy, that you constantly don't have to look at a woman, that you constantly have to just be that holy person. We think it's like extremely harmful to that person. But secondly, it's harmful to the Catholic message that you are vulnerable to God, that you don't have to be perfect, right? That's a message that the Catholic Church already has, that you take pride within your weakness and God still sees you in your weakness, and that's something that is important. But thirdly, it leads to a huge power play, and this is something that is extremely important, because the reason why many kids don't go to report these people is because they see them on a pedestal, right? At the point in which you touch that kid and he sees you as next to God, it's hard for them to go out and say that this person did this, right? And that's the reason why it's very easy for them to do so and get away with it, right? Pedophilia and abuse isn't something of the past. It's something that will still go on, especially when they consider to the fact that sexual desires don't die down, right? I mean, there's a reason why people castrate dogs, right? You're still always going to want to exercise that sexual tendency, right? So slip-ups will still happen on that side of the house. It's crucial to note that those slip-ups are things that spoil the image of the Catholic Church, and that means you lose numbers, right? So the one concrete command that you have to win over the world is something that is lost due to something that is highly speculative as to whether you should get married or not. I think the Pope needs to prioritize what is solid and what is concrete, which is you winning people into the Catholic Church and protecting the image of the Catholic Church, in comparison with something that is highly speculative and isn't something that you need to be concerned with. Secondly, why removing celibacy is crucial within the Catholic Church trajectory, right? I've already explained to an extent why this is highly speculative, the verse that we read. One other reason why it's highly speculative is that the following verses of that verse in 1 Corinthians, Paul literally says, I am not saying this by the Holy Spirit, but this is an advice that I have, and this is a suggestion that I have. The way in which we know this is that many church leaders back then got married, right? So the people that church rolled with, that Paul rolled with, were people who literally got married. You can't tell me that all of those people were committing things that were committing sins, and Paul was extremely okay with it back then. He held people out within the church to get married. You can't tell me that this is something that is a concrete command within the Bible. This means that this is something that is at best speculative, and that's where the Pope's job comes in. We think the Pope's job is to interpret things within the Bible, especially within the context of things that aren't unclear, things that aren't commands, and things that there's a lot of controversy concerning, that the Pope ought to be able to clear that controversy and says that this is what God's word is, right? And they can't just say that everyone is going to go haywire and kick out the Pope, right? Actually, before I go on closing.
What's the criterion the Pope should use to interpret what's in the Bible?
I started my speech with commands and things that are speculations, right? This is a speculation, and this harms the church. Therefore, the Pope should be able to interpret it in ways that it helps the church out, right? Why the Pope should do it, right? I think that's his job, to interpret things that are unclear, right? And secondly, you need to consider that the Pope's word is taken as holy. It's not just the case that every single person is going to be rioting on the street as though one politician said something that they don't like, right? Many of these people see the Pope's word as the next best thing to God actually writing it down within a Bible, right? Believing that he wrote it down in a Bible, right? We think then, given that, it's important for the Pope to prioritize something that is concrete and something that harms the church image, right? That the constant pedophilia and the constant scandals are things that harms your ability to get numbers, right? That's something that is concrete and needs to be prioritized, as opposed to some speculation as to whether you should get married or not. Also, given the fact that the Pope is someone who has been able to advance and show that the church should be something that is progressive in order to win numbers, I think it's important for this Pope to be able to say that we need to take a stand on this, right? And that's something that is able to be understood by the cardinals. The next speech needs to address why this is so crucial and this is going to harm the Catholic Church. Extremely proud to oppose.
So, dear panel, as a Catholic, I would love to claim I have a personal interest in this motion, but let's be honest, that's quite unlikely. What we are going to bring you closely from closing opposition is the distinction that's fundamental to Christianity. It's the distinction between the worldly and the heavenly. Crucially, the Pope is the representation of that's what's heavenly on earth. That doesn't only mean that consequences are by definition not the thing we should look at in this, but it also means it will be seen as being perceived as a direct attack on human dignity. Given the fact that it crucially has been precisely what the Pope has been using to drive the progressive policies, this is the stupidest PR move you could possibly think of. In his speech, 3 points of rebuttal. Then, why this is fundamentally against everything against Christian doctrine and why you should deeply care about it. 2, adding 4 crucial things on why the backlash will be so big, so massive. So, let's dive into rebuttal. Firstly, OG tells us discourse is important. AK should be able to talk about sex with your priest and the church should be able to talk about sex within itself. 1, on the priest. I think you can still talk with the priest. Priests are being explicitly instructed on how to do so. If an absolute condition for that is your priest is actually having sex himself, I think you can go to an elder, to a deacon. I really don't see why that's part of this debate. Second claim, we need a macro discussion on the role of sex plays. Note that we are having this discussion, that we have it for ages. Like, honestly, there are specific guides on what sort of sexual positions you can use when having sex, when you have what condition, right? I really don't think more discourse about sex is precisely what the Catholic needs and never explained why this is the crucial thing in there. For example, also know that pedophilia has been seen as a significantly bigger sin than other kinds of sex already having this kind of discourse and discussion. Never explained why this is necessary. Then, CG tells us, well, this is a lovely distinction between commands and orders. But the crucial thing is this, is the Pope's job, if anything else, to decide whether something is a command or order. I ask CG, well, how should he decide? The response is basically, he should listen to me. I think given an amazing interpretation of religion, but more crucially, I think the Pope should probably decide himself, given the fact that he's the reputation of Jesus Christ on earth. Probably way to do so is directly in line with the most fundamental Christian doctrine. We are going to explain why this is the only way to do so, directly in line with Christian doctrine. Lastly, I hate to talk about unsexual abuse. I think there are 3 crucial things why sexual abuse is uncompared in this debate. 1, as sad as it is, now this almost exclusively happens in boarding schools and places where no women or consenting adult men are. Even if you play sexual desires are okay, you're not allowed to leave these places, you're there 99% of the time. It means incredibly unlikely that if there's a link between sexual urges and abuse, still the children are going to be the victims on comparative. But true crucially, we completely denounce that there's a link between sexual desires and sexual abuse. The first thing we teach in year's consent class is because of sexual desires, but of power relations. We also, for example, know that guards who have consenting wife or consenting sexual partners still abuse many people in prison. We think it's much likely to get an articulation of that. What's then the crucial thing? The crucial thing is that you need measures to prevent it. Now that these measures are hugely controversial in the church, and that Pope Francis, if anyone else, directly tried to implement them. For example, stronger safeguarding, for example, reparation to victims. You only can do that at the moment you have a big political support. We think you're losing this political support. That's why abuse is significantly better on the our side of the house. Rest of the rebuttal interwoven on Catholic doctrine. Note, crucial to Christianity is that there's a direct distinction between the heavenly and the worldly. This, for example, why specific commandments are in the Old Testament rather than the New Testament, and Jesus told pretty much fake stories, right? Or at least parables, and gave him more general idea on earth. But also now that it directly traces back to doctrine, Aquinas directly outlined it. Crucially, the role of the Pope is then to represent heaven on earth. He is the Pontifex Maximus, the maximum bridge, well, it's an unhappy relation, but you know what I mean, the maximum bridge builder. His job is to represent heaven directly on earth. Know that he's the replacement of Jesus, the person that, well, the semi-God that is sent from God to earth in order to bring the heavenly to the world and to show us what the heavenly crucial thing look like. That's the job the Pope has, and that's what he probably should be doing. There are 2 ways in this is relevant. 1, I think it quite effectively deals with CG and the point about desire still remaining. Yes, they will still remain, but we don't have to come up with utilitarian laws. We have to come up with things that are as much in line. At the moment you are going to affect your laws and your religious laws on direct consequences, you're taking the imperfect worldly and directly have to affect the heavenly perfect world. That is something that directly goes against all doctrines and something you therefore fundamentally never do. But 2 crucially means that sex directly violates this. At the moment you're having sexual desires, you're taking yourself as an object, and you're taking the person you're having those sexual desires about an object as well. There are no longer humans with an inherent dignity directly derived from God. There are things that are directly for worldly pleasures, instrument tools for those directly worldly pleasures. Know that sexual desires are uniquely worldly. They are generally speaking short-lasting. There's no deeper satisfaction from it. If there's anything far away from God, it's directly God. To instrumentalize yourself and to instrumentalize another person for that sex is something you can fundamentally never do. Then they say, aha, but you you know, people should still have sex. Yeah, of course, because if Catholics wouldn't have sex, Catholicism would stop persisting, right? That obviously comes in the sense of Jesus. The crucial thing is this. People who are priests, or even lower in the hierarchy, said we are fundamentally different from other humans. What we crucially are, we are the people that want to dedicate our lives to God in the most purest way. Then instrumentalizing yourself and then instrumentalizing others for these directly worldly pleasures goes directly against doctrine. What does that mean? First, it means that at the moment Pope Francis does is it's crucially denying the most fundamental distinction in Christianity. But it means a second, even more pernicious meaning. Know that human dignity, and the notion of human dignity, is directly derived from the fact that we are stemming from God. That we are placed here with a reason. That we are simply on God because God wants us to be, and not for some other reason. At the moment you start prioritizing worldly pleasures, you fundamentally deny that human dignity, you fundamentally deny that agency. That is something you can never do. 2. Backlash. Oh, said, people will dislike this, therefore bad things might happen. We had 4 crucial things. 1. In terms of the context. No, that Pope Benedict XIV, Joseph Ratzinger, was uniquely short because he resigned before he actually died. It means he put in loads of cardinals, which is generally something popes do at the start of the speech. Given the fact that you can't fire a cardinal, we just have to wait until they die out. Now that they are uniquely conservative because Pope Benedict was a uniquely conservative pope. Given the fact that Pope Francis is progressive, and far more progressive than we thought when we were voting him in, that means he's continuously facing direct backlash and having a campaign struggle. That means there's already quite a big group within the Vatican who regrets, sometimes almost openly, the fact that they elected him Pope, but also are directly voting against him. There's a middle group which is sort of doubtful, but is still willing to implement some kind of policy. Within that context, alienating that middle group by taking away the most fundamental doctrine is even more harmful because you don't longer get them into any policy. That's why this is crucially bad. But 2, notice that the narrative he has been using has that human dignity. When asked about homosexuality, he said, we are all people of God, you should never judge. Taking the human dignity away by using them as a tool for worldly pleasures precisely takes away that he can claim the human dignity and use it to implement policy for refugees, for homosexuals, and he can no longer claim the narrative as their own to the moderate cardinal. That means he directly loses the opportunity to do great things. But 3, notice that going to make cardinals not met. The Pope does things that are could be interpreted as against the Bible all the time. This, however, denotes that crucial fundamental distinction, and is therefore seen as uniquely bad and will face a unique backlash. But 4thly, know that cardinals, to some extent, are selfish or at least view themselves as special. They are crucially different. OD sits up here and quite literally says, well, we think everyone should be sort of equal in the church. Note that cardinals are already massively attacking Pope Francis because he sees him as too equal, because in not respecting the natural hierarchy that stands within the Catholic Church. At the moment the Pope then takes that narrative of being equal, he further alienates them. He takes away their special position, they feel even more threatened, and will start them even more. Sexual desires deny that you are human from God and you have an inherent dignified value. The Pope, if anyone, can never respect that. Please oppose.
We think the Catholic Church is still faced by the dirt of when Pope Benedict resigns or back down, right? The issue of pedophilia and stuff. And we think these are controversies and issue that the Catholic Church has still not fully recovered from, right? And then we think they cannot just assert that because these are not necessary issues, like the Pope should not be poke-nosing into things that are not that are irrelevant, right? So we think in order for them to assert that, they need to be able to prove a certain guarantee or a metric that this kind of controversy that rocked the Catholic Church when Benedict retired is something that won't resurface again with an unnecessary policy. My speech will be a bit messy in terms of like integrating rebuttals within my speech, but I'll just like put it under two main clashes. Firstly, why this Pope? Why Pope Francis uniquely? And then secondly, the interest of the Catholic Church and why probably it will be welcome, because they said it's likely not going to be welcome, right? And then the first clash will be directed to fully engage with OG and slightly OO and slightly CO, and then the second is totally engaging CO, right? But before then, quick CO argument that didn't quite fit in, right? Because firstly, they asserted that there is no link between like sexual desires and the controversies of pedophilia, right? Without like pointfully proving what the like bridges are. But we'll tell you from side closing government is that one, right? When you are sexually frustrated as an individual, right? Your target becomes the most vulnerable member of the society, which is why a cardinal would likely sexually abuse a child that knows won't report them rather than someone that's in the rightful state. I will tell you, it becomes problematic on their side of the house. Is these individuals are being viewed in the holiness like position that want to put them in the position of close to God or next to God within those regards. And we think like if these individuals keep seeing themselves that way, it even becomes extremely difficult for them to seek help on their side of the house, right? At least these are the unnecessary barriers we take away, right? But more importantly, right, is this actually that crucial when it comes to the interpretation of what the Bible holds on to? We'll tell you no, right? Because Eric clearly explained to you what are the command values and what are like some things perceived as advice in the Catholic Church. And we think like as the Pope, right, your sole duty when it comes to your obligation to the Christian society is to ensure a proper interpretation of what the religion represents, right? So by removing this core value, right, we think you more often than not leave these interpretations to the cardinal themselves. It's now between them and their God and how they want to face their God when they go back, right? So we think on our side of the house, the reverend fathers that won't want to opt in to this won't opt in, but the ones that feel like, yeah, this does not undermine my ability to be able to be a reverend father, but it's just something like my form of vulnerability, right, are still able to go within those desires. Because we heard from OO that no, you can just quit, right? We tell you it's extremely difficult for them to quit. Firstly, right, because it's a dirt in their name, right? This is something they've worked hard for, right? Which is more likely that they would rather not quit than abuse that vulnerable member of their society or like unlikely children within those circumstances, right? And secondly, right, if you say you're just gonna let them go within those circumstances, right, we'll tell you they won't go easily on their side of the house, right? They'll fight back to you and they'll tarnish your image, which is what we've often seen when it comes to cases of nuns getting pregnant unnecessarily and being forced out of the Catholic Church, right? More often than not, they say like it's an unnecessary like a policy that exists within the Catholic Church and it's something like that's extreme in nature, right? But why exactly Pope Francis, right? Because we think one of the things Pope Francis have achieved when moving the Catholic forward is like the ability for the Catholic Church to look more appealing to people. He has put himself in places of like being able to interpret the teachings of the Bibles in a more moderate way. And this is what is actually achieved. So we think this is actually quite beneficial to his legacy as a pope, right? Because if you are the pope that has like preach like some kind of level of welcome or sympathy towards the LGBT movement, abortion right, and things like this, right, then we'll tell you that in order for you to be viewed as that less extreme Catholic Church, right, you need to be able to clean all the controversies that makes you look a lot more extreme within those circumstances, right? We think any form of controversies that happen when Benedict retire is something the Catholic Church may not recover from going forward on their side of the house. Yes, Omer.
So your proposal says the moment you let priests be with other women, they will stop touching kids. Tell me, are pedophiles men who only touch kids because they can't find women?
Even if they have the desire to touch kids, right, we'll tell you that if they are not seen as, if they are not placed on this pedestal of standards, right, they are able to come out and seek help about it. They are able to explain themselves as being men and somebody that is vulnerable to all this like nature, like natural, whatever that it's being called, right? So they are able to come out and explicitly like explain themselves within those regards, right? Your policy makes it extremely difficult for all this to happen. So yes, right, even if we don't completely like change that pedophilic mindset, right, we at least tell you that we put it in the limelight that, you know what, these individuals are not like the god or unhumanly god that you think they are, but people that are subject to all these form of vulnerabilities, and this does not extremely harm their ability to be able to function as a reverend father or whatever. But would the Pope actually be voted out when it comes to the cardinal, right? We tell you that they are not that irrational, right? Because when it comes to this, right, the Pope is not going to say, oh no, this actually not that important, we need to kick it out, right? Because when it comes to the in terms of backlashes, right, you need to do it in such a way that you need to bring like the counter interpretation to this verse on why it's totally not necessary within those regards. And we think this is things that will be welcome, most likely be welcomed by these cardinals, right? Because it's something that directly affects their lives, right? This is the pain they go through as humans, as individuals on their side of the house. They will likely sit like around the table, discuss why it's extremely important, and see like various reasons why it's important within those circumstances, right? So we don't just see it how it's going to like trigger some form of like uncertainty or some kind of like backlashes within those circumstances when it comes to those regards, right? Finally, right, we'd like to engage like side closing opposition on the idea that, you know what, when it comes to the doctrine of the Catholic Church or the core values you hold on to, right, we tell you that all these things are teaching. We need to be able to teach ourselves within those circumstances, right? The fact that like even if it's written clearly that this is what family values should be in the Bible, or this is what the society should be in the Bible, does not necessarily mean that that's exactly what it should be. If you as a Catholic Church can take a step back in being welcoming and being palatable towards people, you need to be extremely like willing to let go of certain core values or certain principles, even that's if at the very best they are, to be able to be seen as a doctrine that people can easily opt into. We don't think this policy helps anyway.
To create a utilitarianly speaking better world, there are a lot of things that he should change in the Bible right now. But we say that that's simply not his job nowadays. Why? Because the key job of a pope is to represent the divinity, the divine, and create a distinction between what is divine and what is earthly. We say in this debate, even though we're going to engage with all the practical stuff, if this is how the Pope sees the divine to be, that is what he should explain. Why? Because he has the primary task to explain what the doctrine should be like. Then whether that is being followed up by the followers of the church, by the priests, is secondary to what his true incentives are. Because it's up to you as a follower of a religion to decide whether you want to follow the divine. However, given the fact that there's only one person that can tell you what the divine should be, that is the primary task that he should always uphold. That's a part of the extension that Roel brought to you that we got no engagement with at all. Meaning for this debate, that even if they prove you all the practicalities, and it might sound counterintuitive, they still haven't proved why the Pope should do it, because we say it's not his primary task. No, thank you. Given that, there was one sort of moral claim that came out of the proposition bench. Namely, since priests don't know what they opt into, it's unfair to do this. The DLO already quite funny explained that you can just stop. But also quite funny is even if you are forced into doing so, they never explained why the Pope should care about that. We could still say, yeah, even if that's true, the Pope just shouldn't care because he has more important things to talk about. We got never a clear impact on that point in the debate. So we think right now in this debate, the Pope should do what is right according to what the most divine thing is and not the most practical thing. But we had a second extension about practicalities, and here I will deal with most of the prop case. Because what OO gives you is that there will be a backlash because there are conservative people. However, they miss two things. Because in order for a backlash to happen, you need some kind of critical mass. You need a lot of people or important people to make that backlash happen. That's the first thing that Roel adds. Because by his context of explaining how the cardinals work, he actually explains why that group is so powerful and big enough to actually make that change. then secondly, he adds a second thing. He says that the narrative that the Pope is now using to help refugees is that it is in line with the divine thing, the best thing to do, namely helping your fellow person, your fellow human being. We say by opting into this new message, he takes a step away from saying that everything that he's doing and has done so far is out of the view of the divine. And therefore what that means is that the other people can use the rhetoric that all other policies that he tried to implement are also just because of earthly pleasures or something that he as a person prefers. We think that in itself gives way less power to the rhetoric that the Pope had before. That crucial part of context is necessary to actually prove OO's harms. But what does that mean? We think that this means that even if the church would get less followers, as they say, even if there would be less discussions about sex within marriage, as OG wants to claim, the fact that we have a bigger chance to accept homosexuality, the fact that we have a bigger chance to actually saving asylum seekers from drowning is a way bigger impact. And this also might sound very harsh, but even if they would have proven that abuse would not stop, I'm gonna explain why it stops, but even if that's true, we think that the amount of people that right now die on boats and the amount of gays that are beaten up due to the idea of religion are such a big and important group that even though I don't want to make a trade-off, I think we still win that trade-off. But now let's just engage with their point so that you don't have to make the trade-off. I want to start with the abuse point. Because Roel gave you 3 responses on why abuse wouldn't decline. And the response was, but that's not true. Okay, I could say, yes, it is true, and then we gave as much analysis. But Roel and I think that rape has as much to do with sex as hitting someone with a pan has to do with cooking. We think that the reason why people are raped is because of that abuse of power. It's because of those border schools that Roel talked about and we got no response to. But we also say, even if that's not true, and you want to impose rules, you need those conservative cardinals. Given our entire backlash argument, we explain to you why it's more likely to get those cardinals to your side and therefore impose the rules that you actually need. So even if that's true, those rules are easier to implement under our side of the house. Go.
Yeah, so why isn't the Pope able to reinterpret and explain to these cardinals why this isn't something that is extremely crucial and explain why it's something that can be let go of?
Why he should or why he shouldn't?
Your argument of backlash lies on the fact that this is so crucial. Why isn't the Pope able to explain that this isn't crucial and can be let go of?
The Pope could explain to cardinals that it's quite crucial to not touch little children. But that isn't always working. We say the Pope sometimes needs support in order to make his message happen. You were the ones claiming that you need support to make those changes. If we show to you that you don't have that support under our side of the house, then that point still falls. But 2 more points within the practical clash. First of all, the power of the church and the amount of followers that the church has. First of all, OG brings you an argument that it is important to talk about other kind of sex things, like the hookup culture, that kind of stuff. And that therefore you should start with this. First of all, never explained why you should start with this and why this is an easier message to start with than starting with the hookup culture. We think startup with the hookup culture is easier. Why? Because you're not directly blaming the priests, but you're saying other people that do have the same religions, but are not as strict as we are, they have problems that we need to talk about. But secondly, if opening Gav explains to you that right now the amount of followers that the church has is declining, it means that it gets more important for the church to talk about those issues. So we think those issues will already be talked about on the our side of the house. Then we get a kind of contradiction in the CG case, because CG tells us, first of all, there will still be the same amount of abuse, because right now cardinals have too much power, but they also tell you, you give the message that people are not perfect because people think about sex and about marriage. Why is that contradictory? Because on the one hand, they say you need to listen to the incentive of the church to get as much followers as possible. At the other hand, they say you need to take away authority from those clergy people. We think those 2 things never co-align, because when you take away that authority, they will also have less authority on the people that follow them, so you're less likely to follow them. Then OG says you need to talk about sex with your priest. Why can you still do that? The reason why you trust them is because your family was quite religious, because you were baptized there, and therefore probably still trust your priest. And guys, even if a priest doesn't have sex, he knows that it existed. He was born in the first place. So we think that he still has an idea on what sex should be like within marriage, even if he hasn't done it himself. Therefore, we ask you to oppose.